So this is the final part of chapter 1. This is part 3, the Neolithic era and the transition to agriculture. So the last screencast we looked at the Paleolithic era and those big takeaways of the idea of gender equality and the influence that fertility had on life in general, on the regeneration and the ability to produce, and that this idea spread into the Neolithic Revolution that we'll talk about today. So we're going to look at the Neolithic era and the transition to agriculture. And probably one of the main things that you need to think about is that this will change the world forever. And it does start with farming, with the origins of agriculture in the Neolithic era. So the Neolithic era, Neolithic means the new Stone Age, the new Stone Age. Paleolithic means old Stone Age. Neolithic means new Stone Age. And that's just because of the types of tools they were using, that they became more developed. And this is also the early stages of agriculture that we're going to see. So these are some of the tools that they began to use, especially when they were farming. These are some of the early farming tools that were used. So one of the big reasons that we were able to have farming was this idea of global climate change. 15,000 years ago, it was really cold and you had the temperatures fluctuating up and down, and there was a lot of rain, and it just wasn't sustainable enough to have agriculture. But after the Ice Age, the earth will get warmer, and things will become more consistent and more suitable and stable for agriculture to happen. And because of this, you have the Neolithic people who are going to take advantage of this, and they're going to begin to plant and to farm. And believe it or not, it really was the women who started the agricultural revolution. And it makes sense because they were the ones that were picking the berries and, working with the land, whereas the men were the ones that hunted. And the men will, instead of continually hunting, now during this time period, they're going to begin to domesticate these animals. So this is just a map of the Neolithic River Valley civilizations. We're going to look at each of these civilizations in more detail. But again, it really does start in this area in the Middle East, and then you see all the other areas that it goes to. And you really have to remember that even though this is considered the first area, it's all kind of happening at the same time. So again, like I said, one of the first signs of agriculture was in different areas. It starts in 9000 BCE in Southwest Asia, which we know would be like considered modern day Iraq. And we see it all the way in 3000 BCE in South America. So even though that seems, like a lot of time has passed, in the grand scheme of things, in the historical scheme of things, that's not much time at all that has passed. So agriculture was able to spread through various methods. One of the methods they talk about in the book is the slash and burn cultivation. And essentially what it was that you were going to cut the bark of the trees, and then you're going to burn the dead trees, and this was going to create that fertile soil that you could use to plant. The problem was this is that as you planted over and over, the soil was going to get bad. So you would have to do the same process in a different area. But this was one of the first ways that they did begin to farm. And some foods were only found in certain areas, and some of the foods were physically demanding to harvest. So, with farming beginning, we see the development of villages and towns, and we also see the development of specialization of labor that begins to occur. So, if you're going to have the agriculture, you're usually going to settle near the fields. I mean, it makes sense. This is what you're doing for your survival now is, harvesting. So you're going to begin to settle in areas that are close to there. Jericho was one of the earliest first known villages, and this provided a lot of people a surplus of food, which also meant new jobs. So you need to think of this. you're farming, and not everybody has to do that one job. Maybe it takes 5 people to farm. So, what are the other 100 people going to do? Well, they're going to develop a new skill. They're either going to become metal workers, or they're going to become pottery makers, or textile makers, or they're going to work in, some sort of governance position. But it will always create new jobs. Just keep in mind that, farming is going to lead to this specialization of labor. So Catalhayuk, this was the Neolithic town that we see, probably the earliest one that showed that there was this idea of a specialization of labor. You can see right here, this is kind of just a drawing of how they think the town was mapped out really close to each other. And if you look, a lot of the stuff looks similar. Like there's no main distinctions here. And that's really important to note this, okay? This standardization. And then, like I said, you had the clay pottery being made as well during this time. So, in terms of pottery and metalworking, they're created for practical purposes. Obviously, to store the surplus of foods. Again, you're already harvesting, which means you're going to make a lot of food and you need some place to hold it. So, it would make sense to have the pottery being made. The metalworking would be used for either for farming or for weaponry, however they saw fit. And sometimes they would also create, jewelry, or they would put kind of like an artistic design on the pottery. So, the artisanry is coming in at this time as well. Textiles, they learned how to breed animals together because they would use those fibers to make stronger textiles. So maybe you wanted a thicker, you know, a thicker basket. So they would be able to breed the animals to create that kind of fiber for them. Again, here are some more textiles that they would have created during this time. Social distinctions and social inequality. So we looked yesterday at how the Paleolithic era demonstrated definite gender equality. The Neolithic era will take that to the opposite end, and it will actually be where we see this idea of social distinction and social inequality. And it will change, in terms of society, it will change it forever. So, this is the first time in history that people can accumulate wealth, that you can say, this is my property, this is what I own, and it's mine, and you can't have it. You also see this use of a barter system where, okay, I have 10 goats, I'll give you 5 of them for 1 cow, something to that effect, that kind of barter system. And of course, that development of private property, which means that the more land you had, would mean the more wealth you had, which means the more power you have. And, that's going to remain true for pretty much all of history from here on out. Land equals wealth equals power. And it's not until there's some sort of external internal conflict that destroys that. And we also see this idea of social classes emerging. Somebody who's at the top, somebody who's at the bottom. So here are your first discussion questions, questions 5 and 6. How did agriculture change the world? And how did agriculture affect social status? So we're going to move on to the Neolithic culture. Here we see a dependence on agriculture that led to the knowledge of moon and stars. So we're going to see how agriculture will affect the world around us, the way we look at the world. They needed to know how and when to harvest. So they learned that, well, during this season when the stars look a certain way and they're in certain positions, then this would be the best time to harvest. And they really used, astronomy to help them in terms of agriculture. And it's really the first steps towards a calendar and keeping track of time. So the Neolithic religion reflected its reliance on the earth, heavy reliance on the earth. And it celebrated the ideas of birth, growth, death, and regeneration. So very similar in that sense to the Paleolithic era. that, fertility is important because it shows not only the growth in us as humans, but it also is related to the earth as well, in that the sense that, okay, if my harvest is growing, that's great because that's regeneration of my crop, which means I'm doing well. During the Neolithic Revolution, we also see the emergence of cities. And this was gradual, it took some time, but it was different from villages and towns in two ways. The first way is that it was more complex. You didn't just have your villages and towns, you have your basics. Okay, you have somebody who farms, you have a metal worker, you have, maybe a pottery maker, stuff like that. But in a city, you have more specialization of labor for one, so that means different people doing different jobs, more population. So instead of, 2,000 people, maybe you have 20,000 people, more professionals, more professional managers like governors, tax collectors, military strategists. So it just becomes more complex in terms of the social distinctions. The second thing that we see here is there's more of an influence on the area around you. Cities will have more influence on the areas around them. Cities will attract traders into their areas, and they'll attract traders from all different places around them. And also, cities will be able to extend their authority to those smaller towns and villages around them as well. And this will also lead them to be able to spread their culture and tradition to their neighboring areas. So here are your final questions, questions 7 through 9. 1, how are the religious values of the Paleolithic and Neolithic societies similar? So what ways did society stay the same in both time periods, even though these time periods were dramatically different? Number 8, reflect on both Paleolithic and Neolithic society. In your opinion, which society is better and why? So, seeing both sides, which one do you think was better? Is social evolution always a good thing? Why or why not? Meaning that after we came into the Neolithic Revolution, you saw how it changed society, and was that necessarily beneficial for all people involved? All right, so that concludes the Neolithic Revolution. The big takeaways here are: 1, it went from hunting and gathering to farming. 2, it created social inequality and social distinctions because of the idea of private property and the division of labor. 3, it created the emergence of civilizations that we know today, like the cities, and it brought in specialization of labor. It brought in more complex positions. It brought in influence to the regions around them as well. All right, so go ahead and answer those questions, and we'll see each other in chapter 2.